And muscular tissues in our presentation today. This presentation is going to be broken into two primary recordings. The first part is going to be the big part, the long part. We're going to focus on the connective tissues and cells of the connective tissues. And then the second recording for this PowerPoint is going to focus on excitable tissues. So we'll take the nervous and muscular tissues and group them together in the part 2 recording. So let's dive in and talk about connective tissues. Unlike epithelial tissues, which don't have a lot of extracellular matrix, connective tissues have tons of extracellular matrix. Most of the cells in a connective tissue aren't actually going to be touching their next door neighbor. There's going to be lots of extracellular space separating those cells. And when we look at our connective tissues, this extracellular matrix that makes up the majority of the volume of our connective tissues, sometimes will have lots of blood vessels in it, so they'll be, be highly vascularized. Other times, it will have very small or very few blood vessels or almost no blood vessels at all in it. And those are connective tissues that, generally speaking, don't regenerate as quickly because they don't have the nutrient supply they need to regenerate. Now, when we look at functions of connective tissues, these connective tissues are all over the chart. We have blood, bone, we have fat. I mean, there's so many different structures when we look at connective tissues that we're going to have lots of different functions associated with that. Remember, one of the unifying themes of anatomy and physiology is that structure determines function. Because we have lots of different structures, we'll have a lot of functions to talk about. So our connective tissues, well, they connect things like organs. Think of tendons and ligaments, where tendons will bind a muscle to a bone and ligaments will bind bone to bone. We can use connective tissues to support things. Bones and cartilage support the body. They're the framework of our bodies. We can use our bones for physical protection, particularly the bony plates of our cranium protect our brain. Our ribs protect our thoracic cavity. When we look at our blood, particularly the leukocytes or white blood cells, they give us immune system function. They help protect us against pathogens that maybe get into our bodies, whether they're single cellular, multicellular, or viral in nature. And then we can also use our connective tissues to help move our bodies. Our skeletal muscle fibers or skeletal muscle cells are going to pull on the bones to move our bodies. We also use connective tissues to store things. Fat is stored in adipose tissue. Calcium and phosphorus are stored in the bones of our bodies, that dense or compact bone tissue. We can use connective tissues to make heat. And when most people think of making heat in our bodies, they think of skeletal muscles, moving the muscles to make heat. But we can also make heat with a special kind of fat. And this special kind of fat that makes a lot of heat for us is called brown fat. I have an infant at home right now. She's itty bitty, but I tell you what, she has a lot of brown fat on her, and she is a furnace. She is so warm. She's constantly giving off body heat, which is nice because it's cold this time of year, so I like holding her because she warms me up. And she also warms my heart. What can I say? And we also use connective tissues to transport substances. And when we think of transportation in the body, immediately your mind should focus on the cardiovascular system or the bloodstream. Wow, there's a lot on this slide. We're going to camp on this for a while, and then we're going to skip ahead and look at the cell type. So I'm going to be oscillating between the names of the cells and looking at the cells. So first we have fibroblasts. When we think of fibroblast, blast means to build. What does this cell build? It builds a fiber, typically collagen fibers. So here we have a fibroblast. We can see the nuclei of the fibroblast in your microscope slides in the lab pretty easily. And this fibroblast is going to build the fibers. We have the very, very thin reticular fiber, almost non-viewable. We have the thin or medium thickness elastic fiber, and then we have the big, bulky collagen fibers. And those are all these different fiber types are made by fibroblast or fiber builder cells. We also are going to have macrophages. And when we think of a macrophage, I want you to think macro, big, phage, to eat. These are the big eating cells. What do macrophages do? Well, first let's find our macrophage. There's the macrophage right here, and this figure doesn't really do it justice in terms of how big the cell is. The macrophage should be the biggest cell on this figure as far as I am concerned. This is a cell that is going to phagocytize or swallow things that do not belong in the body, whether it's a pathogen, whether it's another dead cell, or whether it is debris in the extracellular matrix or of the tissues. We have leukocytes. Leukocytes we've talked about in the lab already. Leukocyte is the technical name for white blood cell. You do not need to know what individual leukocytes do at this point in the course. This is kind of just an FYI right now. Neutrophils are the most common leukocyte in the body, and they focus on attacking bacteria. We have lots of neutrophils in the connective tissues of our body. There's lots of neutrophils in our skin, and we all remember when we were in middle school and we had acne and whiteheads. The pus in the whitehead in our body is made up of lots and lots of neutrophils. That's the white blood cell. It's the most common in the pus in our bodies. We also have plasma cells. These plasma cells are cells that make antibodies. Plasma cells that make antibodies are going to be present in large numbers in the connective tissues of our body, particularly the blood of our bodies, because that's where antibodies focus primarily on our defense. We have a lot of mast cells in our connective tissues. Mast cells secrete two chemicals we really care about, heparin and histamine. Heparin is a blood thinner. Histamine will dilate blood vessels. So here we have a mast cell. They have lots of granules in them. These granules, all those individual granules, store different chemicals that are being pre-manufactured to be secreted. The heparin, which inhibits blood clotting, or the histamine, which dilates our blood vessels. And then we have the adipocytes, or as I really like to say it, the adipocytes. It's kind of a potato. Adipocytes or adipocytes are also just known as fat cells. They are a cell with a nuclei. Notice here there's a little pink nuclei right on the edge here, right on the edge right there. Those adipocytes will store fat or store the triglycerides in our bodies. Now, when we focus on the blast cells, the fibroblast cells, they make collagen, elastic fibers, and reticular fibers. So let's talk about those fiber types. The collagen is the single most abundant fiber of our extracellular matrix. It is one of the most abundant proteins in the body, period, making up 25% of the protein in our bodies. Collagen is a wonderful fiber. It's tough, it's flexible, it's stretch resistant, it does everything almost. And when we look at collagen, not all collagen is made the same. There are multiple kinds of collagen in our bodies, in the different tissues, in the extracellular matrices of the different tissue types. We're not going to focus on the different kinds of collagen in this class. This is just an undergraduate level class, so we're going to group all collagen together. But just be aware that even if you don't see the collagen present, it's still probably there. A classic example is hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage does have collagen in its extracellular matrix, but it's a form of collagen that's very difficult to see in that extracellular matrix. We also have reticular fibers. A reticular fiber is a kind of collagen fiber, but this collagen fiber is going to have a lot of glycoproteins on it. Glyco referring to glycogen. So these reticular fibers with their glycoproteins are going to absorb water, particularly the carbohydrate portion of the glycoprotein is really good at sucking up water, and they'll form the framework particularly in our lymphatic tissues, so our lymph nodes, and our spleen. When we look at reticular tissues, they have lots of reticular fibers in them. And then we also are going to have elastic fibers being made by the fibroblast of our bodies. These elastic fibers, to really emphasize the two key points, is that they're tiny and they're stretchy. Collagen fibers are big and tough. Elastic fibers are tiny and stretchy. The protein is, well, elastin, very appropriately named. What do these elastic fibers do for us? Well, they allow for our tissues to stretch, and when they're done being stretched, to recoil back to their original position. As we look at our connective tissues, I'll say this again, connective tissues have lots of extracellular matrix, and the liquidy portion of the extracellular matrix, to review again, is called the ground substance. And to keep this liquidy ground substance intact, we're going to need a framework, otherwise it would just flow away like water. And this framework is going to be made of different chemicals. The most common chemical is called a glycosaminoglycan. Glycosaminoglycans, or GAGs for short. And there's many different kinds of these chemicals. These chemicals, for lack of a better term, are a molecular sponge. They have a bunch of carbohydrates on them, and these carbohydrates will hydrogen bond with water molecules and cause the tissue to swell up with water. One of the most common glycosaminoglycans is chondroitin sulfate, which you can buy at the store as a supplement to help your cartilage not feel so stiff, to get rid of the achy pain in your knees. Other GAGs, or glycosaminoglycans, include heparin and hydroloric acid. Those typically are a little bit harder to find at the store. The chondroitin sulfate, though, is a very common one that we'll find. Because these chemicals store water in the extracellular matrix of our connective tissues, they do a really good job of regulating the water balance and electrolyte concentrations in our bodies. Recall, an electrolyte is a dissolved ionic compound. Think of sodium ions, potassium ions, chlorine ions, calcium ions, a metallic ion dissolved in water. Now, if we look at our connective tissues, there's some broad categories. We can have loose, or we can have dense connective tissues, and not everything will necessarily fall into these two categories. There's always going to be the exceptions. But when we look at loose and dense connective tissues, our loose ones typically are going to be the areolar or the reticular. Occasionally adipose is put in this category as well. Our dense reticular or dense connective tissues are going to include dense regular and dense irregular. So in terms of how we could categorize these, broadly speaking, if the extracellular matrix has mostly ground substance, it's a loose connective tissue. If the extracellular matrix has lots of fibers, it's a dense connective tissue. So the loose ones don't have the fibers, the dense ones have lots of those fibers, particularly the collagen fibers. So let's look at areolar tissue. Areolar tissue is a really good starting point, and it's also what is pictured on this figure right here. This is a drawing of the parts of areolar tissue. So when we look at areolar tissue, it's one of the single most abundant connective tissues in the body. It's everywhere, and it's everywhere in that it's like the super glue of the body. It helps to bind multiple tissue types together. It has all the main cell types that we've talked about, and it has collagen fibers, it has some reticular fibers, and it also has elastic fibers, and those fibers run in all directions. In lab, we can see the elastic fibers as tiny, thin black lines on our microscope slides, and the collagen fibers are going to be very large, pink, hard to focus on fibers in our slides. We find areolar tissue as a blood-rich or highly vascularized tissue that helps to supply nutrients to the epithelial tissues they're usually located right next to. So our areolar tissue allows for nutrient delivery and waste removal to epithelial tissues. And because it has a nice combination of proteins in the extracellular matrix and lots of ground substance in the extracellular matrix, our areolar tissue allows for the rapid movement of white blood cells, particularly neutrophils, throughout the body. Here's a photomicrograph of the areolar tissue. Notice that we can see these little individual dark nuclei of the fibroblast. In the background, we can see a diffuse, large, thick pink collagen fiber, and then we can see in the foreground a dark, sharp, highly focused elastic tissue fiber. So when we look at this areolar tissue, this is your classic areolar tissue. Up next, we have reticular tissue, another one of the loose tissue types in our bodies. Our reticular tissues are going to have lots of reticular fibers, their namesake, in them. We find that reticular tissues, to emphasize it again, form the stroma, or the supportive framework. When we think stroma, think framework or supportive part of the lymphatic organs of the body and the spleen. So when we look at our lymph node and our spleen, those are the two go-to locations in the body to find lots of reticular tissues. We also have reticular tissue present at the thymus, but it's really difficult to get a good tissue section of a thymus, so we usually don't use the thymus in a lab setting to look at reticular tissues. And we also have a lot of reticular tissue present in our bone marrow. The catch, or the problem about using bone marrow, is there's so many blood cells present in bone marrow, it's really difficult to see the reticular fibers of the reticular tissues in our bone marrow. Now we're going to focus on the dense connective tissues. We have dense regular and dense irregular. Our dense regular connective tissues are going to have wavy collagen fibers all oriented in the same direction, and you can see little speckles or dots. Those little speckles or dots are the compressed nuclei of the fibroblasts that make the collagen. And when we look at this dense regular connective tissue, this is a great way to emphasize structure and function. I know I gave this spiel already to all my lab sections. You notice the fibers are oriented in roughly the same direction. They're roughly parallel to each other because these tissue types make tendons and ligaments. And tendons and ligaments need to be incredibly strong at resisting pulling forces as the bones pull against each other, whereas the muscles pull against the bone, hence all the fibers being oriented in the same direction. Here's another classic example of structure and function. Here are dense irregular connective tissue, and this dense irregular connective tissue has collagen fibers oriented in all different directions. We find lots and lots of dense irregular connective tissues in the dermis of our skin, and what we find is that these dense irregular tissues have fibers that are oriented in all directions so they can withstand stresses in all directions or in unpredictable directions on our bodies. We have adipose tissue as well. I like to categorize adipose tissue as a loose connective tissue because it doesn't have a lot of fibers in its extracellular matrix, but there's just not that much extracellular matrix, generally speaking, for adipose tissue. When we look at our adipose tissue, a good classic example, a good microscope slide with adipose tissue is just going to be filled with adipocytes. It's not going to have a lot of fibers visible in its extracellular matrix. We find that our adipose tissue is made of adipocytes, and those adipocytes store in a storage vesicle triglycerides or fat. And generally speaking, the number of adipocytes in our human is pretty stable. And this is both good news and bad news. The good news is you, generally speaking, don't get more fat cells over the course of your lifetime. The bad news is it's really, really hard to lose an adipocyte. It's generally speaking, when your waistline gets bigger and your waistline gets smaller, as you gain and lose fat on your body, you are going to increase or decrease the size of your adipocytes, but you're generally not going to change the number of your adipocytes. Those triglycerides that are stored in our adipocytes are constantly being recycled, constantly degrading and being regenerated at the same time to help maintain homeostasis with our bloodstream. There's two broad categories of fat. I'd mentioned earlier in this presentation brown fat. Brown fat is present in unborn children, babies, and young children. And it's going to have lots of mitochondrial enzymes present, particularly ATP synthase. And this ATP synthase has a job of just spinning the pump, churning the crank, and making lots of body heat. It's a heat-generating tissue. And if you've ever held a little baby, one of those little chunky, super cute babies, they're really warm because they have a lot of brown fat on their bodies. Now, we as adults, I assume there's no babies watching this presentation, or at least no babies paying attention to it, because that would be really weird. We as adults have white fat on our bodies, and this white fat, or adult fat, doesn't make us warm, doesn't make heat, but it helps to insulate our bodies. It provides a thermal insulation layer. It also provides cushion, and I'm not talking about cushion for the push-in, but I'm talking about cushioning organs in our bodies that need some shock absorption built in. Think of our eyeballs. Our eyeballs are a lot smaller than our orbital cavities in our eyes. So to keep our eyeballs from bouncing around, we have adipose tissue around them. To keep our kidneys from bouncing around in our retroperitoneal cavity, we have a lot of fat around them, particularly because the inferior half of our kidney is not protected by the rib cage. So that part of the kidney will have a lot of fat present. And if we look at the hilum of the kidney, or hilum, depending on how you pronounce it, hilum, that part of the kidney where the blood vessels go in and out and the ureter goes in and out also will have a lot of fat present to help stabilize the tubes. White fat gives the curves to our bodies. Think of the female breast or the female hips. The curviness of the body comes from the white fat. So here we have a classic example of adipose tissue. We have lots of large adipocytes. Each large white space is a storage vacuole of an adipocyte. And then you can see a dark dot on the corner right there. Right there's a dark dot. There's a dark dot. Those dark dots on the margin are the nuclei of the adipocyte. And then over here in the margins, we're going to have some areolar tissue, little pockets of areolar tissues associated with the adipose tissue. Another kind of connective tissue we have 3 variations of is cartilage. And when we look at cartilage, we have a chondroblast, which is a cartilage building cell. And we also have a chondrocyte, a cartilage maintaining cell. And these cartilage cells will both build and maintain our cartilage. The cartilage we use to give, generally speaking, slightly flexible structure to our body. So if you think of our ears, the tip of our nose, our larynx, these are structures that are kind of rigid and kind of flexible. Around our cartilage tissues, we have a membrane known as perichondrium. And the perichondrium is going to be some fibers that help to maintain the integrity of the cartilage and also maintain some adult stem cells, some multipotent stem cells to repopulate the chondroblasts. So should we need to make more cartilage throughout our lifetimes, we'll have the cartilage builders, the chondroblasts, there to build up the cartilage tissues. It should be emphasized, though, that cartilage tissues don't have blood vessels. They are avascular. So those chondroblasts don't get a lot of building blocks to work with. There's a very slow delivery of nutrients, and our cartilage tissue heals very slowly. Our cartilage extracellular matrix, though, is kind of squishy. It has a lot of water present in it. It's going to have a lot of glycosaminoglycans in it, or GAGs in it. And those glycosaminoglycans will retain the water in the extracellular matrix, or in the ground substance of our cartilage extracellular matrix. Depending on the kind of cartilage we're looking at, we have different kinds of collagen fibers, really thick ones or really thin ones. The types of collagen vary with the kind of cartilage we're looking at. So we have our 3 kinds of cartilage: hyaline, fibro, and elastic cartilage. Let's dive in and look at each of those kinds of cartilage. First, we have hyaline cartilage. I always think of hyaline cartilage as eyeball soup. That's the word analogy I use in my head. To me, it looks like a bunch of eyeballs floating around in soup. That extracellular matrix of the hyaline cartilage is going to be made up of very fine collagen fibers that we can't see easily. So it looks like a clear extracellular matrix. And when we look at this hyaline cartilage, it's going to be located in the larynx, it's going to be located in the trachea, it's going to be located at the proximal and distal end of our long bones. We have a lot of it in our rib cage with the costal cartilage, that's cartilage of the rib cage. And this hyaline cartilage, depending on where it is either going to be giving structural support or it's going to be giving a friction-reducing support. So the articular cartilage, the cartilage of our joints, is a kind of hyaline cartilage that functions to reduce the friction in our joints. We also have a lot of elastic cartilage in our bodies. This elastic cartilage is going to have lots of collagen and, in particular, a ton of elastic or stretchy fibers present. Notice, and I should back up here, we have the chondrocytes, the cartilage maintaining cells, and there's little hollow cavities. Those hollow cavities the chondrocytes sit in are called the lacuna. We talked about those during lab, but just to connect lab to lecture, we have the cartilage cell, the chondrocyte. The space the cartilage cell sits in is the lacuna. That's the pocket in the extracellular matrix that makes room for our chondrocytes. So here we have more chondrocytes, more lacuna, more spaces. But notice that here with our elastic cartilage, the fibers, those elastic fibers, relative to the chondrocytes are much, much smaller than the chondrocytes. Generally speaking, you have to zoom in on very high magnification to see the elastic fibers of the elastic cartilage. The 2 best spots in our body to find elastic cartilage are the external ear, the auricle, or the epiglottis, that little fold in the back of our throat that keeps food from going down our larynx and trachea. Our next cartilage type is fibrocartilage. This figure right in your lecture textbook is very, very different from the picture that's present in your lab manual. Your lab manual has a picture of fibrocartilage with a white extracellular matrix and a lot of blue-stained collagen fibers. When we look at this fibrocartilage, this is much more similar looking to what you saw in your lab with the pubic symphysis. You can see that there's purple and pink streaking occurring. This purple and pink streaking that is occurring represents the bundles of collagen fibers. There are lots and lots of bundles of collagen in fibrocartilage. There's lots of fiber in the fibrocartilage. And when we think of a fibrocartilage, I want you to think of it as a shock absorber. Fibrocartilage absorbs impact. So we have fibrocartilage in between every one of the vertebrae in our backbone. This intervertebral disc is a shock absorber. We have the menisci in our knees, little chunks of fibrocartilage in our knees that act as shock absorbers. We have a chunk of fibrocartilage in between the two pubic bones in our pelvic girdle. The pubic symphysis allows for our hips to flex just a little bit, to act as a shock absorber between the two coxal bones of our pelvic girdle. Our next connective tissue type is bone. And there's two broad categories of bone tissue. We have spongy bone tissue and compact bone tissue. Another old school name for spongy bone tissue is trabecular bone tissue because it has lots of little trabeculae in it, or little tiny filaments of bone. Spongy bone tissue is going to be located in the middle of the bone. It's never on the or should never be on the surface of the bone. On the surface of the bone, we have a protective layer called compact bone. Compact bone is very, very distinctive when we look at it on a photomicrograph. And the next couple of slides, I'll show you some photomicrographs. So the spongy bone tissue and the compact bone tissue are the two most common kinds of bone tissues. But there's lots of other tissues associated with bone. We have hyaline cartilage, we have red bone marrow, we have adipose tissues. There's multiple tissue types present with our bone. We also have the ligaments and the tendons, or the dense regular connective tissues. So bones are a very rich source of connective tissues. Many different kinds of connective tissues are present. Here's some compact bone. And as we look at this compact bone, I really want to highlight for you the concentric rings. Each grouping of concentric rings is known as an osteon, and in the center of that osteon in our compact bone, there's a big black tube known as the central canal. The central canal is in the central part of the osteon. The old school name is the Haversian canal, but that's really not used much anymore. As we look at the osteon, there are multiple layers being wrapped around it. Each onion-like layer being wrapped around the osteon is known as a lamella. So here we're zoomed in on one osteon. Excuse me. And we have, as little black dots, a osteocyte, or a bone-maintaining cell. Osteo being a prefix for bone, cyte being a suffix for cell. And there's lots of little black filaments leading away from the osteocytes called canaliculi. Canaliculi allow for one osteocyte to communicate with another adjacent osteocyte, and also allow for the osteocytes to maintain and monitor the amount of stress that we put on our bones. As we physically stress our bones, the canaliculi sense that stress, send a signal to the osteocyte, and then allow for the osteocyte to make our bones stronger or our bones a little bit weaker. Wrapped around the outer perimeter of our bone, we have a membrane known as the periosteum, which is analogous to the perichondroitum. The perichondroitum is going to contain tough fibrous connective tissues that wrap around hyaline cartilage. The periosteum is going to be more tough fibrous tissues wrapping around the entire bone. Our next connective tissue type is going to be blood. And when we think of blood, it's one of the only fluid tissues in the body. There's another fluid tissue, lymphatic fluid, is also considered a tissue as well, but it's not reported very heavily. Blood, though, is the classic tissue that is a liquid at room temperature. And as we look at the blood, the ground substance of the blood, the liquid portion of the blood is called plasma, or sometimes also referred to as blood plasma, or just plasma all by itself. Now, the ground substance of the blood, or the extracellular matrix, doesn't have a lot of proteins in it, but has a lot of liquid. It has a lot of ground substance in it. And within this very viscous, very serous ground substance of very serous, very watery ground substance of the blood, we are going to have a bunch of cells floating around. And these cells, or formed elements, can be categorized into three big groups. We have erythrocytes, red blood cells, which are the most common. They primarily focus on moving oxygen and carbon dioxide around. We have white blood cells, or leukocytes. These focus on protecting our bodies. And then we're also going to have the thrombocytes, or platelets, which are involved in blood clotting. It should be noted, and we'll talk more about these in Bio 314, the 5 big categories of leukocytes are the neutrophil, lymphocyte, monocyte, eosinophil, and basophil. And to remember those, I always use the word mnemonic: never let monkeys eat bananas. And if you can remember to never let a monkey eat a banana, you can remember neutrophil, lymphocyte, monocyte, eosinophil, and basophils. More on that next semester when we get to the cardiovascular system. And I guess this is the time for me to stop making this recording. Guys, girls, if you have any questions about this content on connective tissues, please feel free to shoot me an email, swing by my office hours, and as always, happy studies.